Welcome to Girls Gone Wellness, Dr. Nagra.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you on today. Me and Vic were talking before you came on, but when we started this podcast about a year and a half ago, we had a list of our dream guests that we wanted to interview, and you were definitely at the top of that list. So we're super excited to have you here today. Anyone that knows you knows your Instagram reels and your ability to be able to break down nutrition research and just dispel some of the crazy myths that we see online is so needed. And again, the fact that you are a naturopathic doctor as well is very cool. You really represent the best of our profession. So we're very excited to have you on today.
Thanks. Try my best.
It's hard out there. Can you introduce yourself and just how you got into naturopathic medicine and then specifically the nutrition space too before we jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I would say they both really overlap, the interest in nutrition and going into this profession. So when I was younger, I struggled with some things like weight management. My asthma was pretty bad at points. Had some other health concerns, and it wasn't until I started shifting my nutrition that I really started noticing results, or at least lasting results. When I adopted a plant-based diet, as many of my followers will know. I don't know about yours. And so that's when I started around the age of 15 or so, started getting interested in nutrition, and then over the years, I learned more and more. Eventually went to university where maybe things were slipping a bit, and I was drinking with my friends on the weekends. I was eating cafeteria food, etc. And there was just a point in my second semester where I decided, it was my first year, second semester, where I decided that, overnight, basically, I was going to go 100% plant-based. Never looked back since then. Felt really good since. Throughout that same year, I started to learn more about like the ethical considerations as well, what happens to animals in the food system, et cetera. And that has really kept me firmly on the plant-based or vegan lifestyle. And then, over the next couple years there, I knew I wanted to go into the healthcare space. I looked at medicine, looked at a few other avenues, and I was sort of interested. I actually read a book by a naturopathic doctor, so I was somewhat familiar and sort of interested in that field as well. And one of my instructors at the time actually saw a naturopathic doctor, and both her doc and her doc's husband ran a clinic together. And so I went in and shadowed them for a few days. I think a few days spread over maybe a month or so. And I was more exposed to just how broad the scope was. It wasn't necessarily what I thought. I mean, there was a lot of things from pharmaceuticals, prescriptions to nutrition counseling, to even physical therapies, et cetera. And those are all things that I was very much interested in. And from there, I went and I sat in at the Boucher Institute for a day, or now CCNM, in New West in BC here. And I sat in, I remember, on an anatomy class, and then I spoke with a bunch of students from kind of all ranges from first year up to fourth year, and just learn more about like what they're doing, what their plans are beyond school, et cetera. And I just really, I thought it would be a good way for me to really practice the nutrition aspects while still having access to medication and being able to hopefully balance the best of both worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a lot of people, they don't realize, at least in BC, how broad the scope is for naturopathic doctors. And that was also something that I really liked as well when I was kind of choosing what profession to go into. I'm in Ontario now, but I'm looking to move out to BC for the same kind of scope as well. And I think it's really interesting that we do kind of have the best of both worlds, and we're taught the best of both worlds as well. I also think it's so funny that overnight you went 100% plant-based and that you just never look back. It's crazy.
Well, I'd say over the years previous, so like from about age 15 to, I would guess I was 18 or whatever at the time, during that period, I had learned a lot. I'd shifted a lot towards plant-based.
Okay.
when I was back on the cafeteria diet, essentially at a university, I was slipping a bit the other way. And so at a point, I was like, you know what? No, I'm just going all in. I'm not going to give myself that leeway.
Yeah.
Just as a personality, that works better for me.
Right. A lot of people know you from your social media. I'm just curious, like, how did you decide to, grow your social media, post videos, all of that? Because I think for some people it can be quite intimidating, and you can get a lot of pushback as well, which I'm sure you get your fair share of. So, like, how did you start that, and how do you kind of deal with all of that as well?
So I actually took about a year between finishing school and starting practice. I did a bunch of traveling and that during the time because I didn't really take a break. I went straight from high school to undergrad to the NT school. And so I really, wanted a bit of a break there. And then during that time, um, maybe the second half of that time, I decided, I'm not necessarily practicing yet or anything, but I wanted to start putting some info out. I had a lot of friends, both here in Vancouver and elsewhere, who, were doing a lot on social media, some with rather large followings as well. And I would always talk with them about nutrition. And so I had the idea of maybe I can get some of this out there more publicly. And so I started sharing some stuff. And then I had friends like Erin Ireland, who people may follow. She runs a bakery here in Vancouver, is very well known in the vegan scene, especially. She shared some of my stuff, and then that picked up. And then another friend of mine now, Simon Hill from Australia, who has a big following and a massive podcast, he then saw my content and started sharing it. And I've now been on his podcast like 7 or 8 times, and we're good friends. And so like it just sort of, I guess, snowballed that way. It really only takes, 1 or 2 people to sort of help get your name out there, and then that can make a difference. And so it took off much quicker than I planned to. I remember when I was going into my first week of actual practice, because I had Aaron especially, mentioning it on socials, I was like fully booked. I just been off for a period of time. I'm going into my first week, and it was hectic because at that time, you guys might do it differently now, but when I was in school, we did paper charts, and now everything had switched to online. And so like I I had to play around with it for a couple weeks prior, just to like figure out, okay, where does stuff go? How do I enter all this?
Oh my gosh.
And so I had to really, really do it all on the fly. But anyways, it's not, in hindsight, it's not a bad thing, but it was a lot for right out the gate. And then, on the other side of what you said about pushback, I talk about this with some friends of mine who are on socials, who maybe do a more, we'll say, controversial. I don't know if controversial is the right word, but like topics or reels or posts that are more likely to get pushback even than mine, and mine get a fair share. But we tend to, amongst this group and myself, we tend to just not care, honestly. Like it doesn't bother us if people want to, like, I get racist comments and stuff. Like it just, for me, it is more reflection on them. Like I don't really care, but I totally understand how that can really affect people. I have friends as well who are maybe dietitians and, mothers to young kids, and then they get called like bad parents for feeding their child a plant-based diet or whatever, and like that really hurts them and really affects them. And so I don't know that I have great advice to deal with that, because for me, I'm fine at just kind of brushing it aside, or maybe chirping back with a sarcastic comment or something. Whereas I think it can affect certain people, but it's something that, like, if you're going to get into the space, if you're going to be posting publicly, and especially if you garner something of a following, you kind of have to be ready for that to happen. It's going to happen. There's a lot of faceless, nameless trolls on the internet, and there's a lot of bots, that will just spew stuff as well.
Jeanette, do you think we should take a year off and just get really controversial online? Because I'm down if you're down.
It's funny.
It's funny because I don't know why, but I feel like nutrition is almost up there with like politics and religion for some reason online. Like people get really heated about it. And I feel like what you're posting is actually not controversial. You're literally just relaying evidence, and people just don't like it. And so their only response is like racism or just like super harsh comments, because they just don't have any other way to express that feeling. I just don't understand why it's such a hot topic when you're really just giving. I even find like you're plant-based, but I find you're super unbiased online too. It's not like, yeah. So I got to know, because if you went plant-based mostly when you were quite young, why was it plant-based? Because I'm assuming at that point you didn't have kind of like that research background that you have now. So what made it plant-based? Like, why was that kind of your go-to at that point?
It was actually a personal trainer at the time who really promoted that sort of a diet. It's someone who I really trusted, who himself was, very fit and healthy and all of that. And so it was much more superficial, I guess. And then when I started to actually make some of those changes, I saw improvements myself. So it was probably very much like how people choose what diet they're going to follow today. Like if you look at the broader, population, it's because they hear something or they see something on social media or whatever that leads them to adopting something. I just happened to get lucky and it wasn't, a carnivore diet or something. I feel like at the time as a 15-year-old male, I could have easily gone the other way. I've been influenced in that way. And so, that got me, I guess, into the area. And over the years, I refined my approach to be more in line with the evidence. That there are certainly extremes in the plant-based realm as well. And so it was a learning curve, but I'm glad that I sort of started on the right foot.
Definitely. Yeah. So when we think of so let's say you're talking to someone about diet and they're asking you just general, what is a healthy diet? Would you say, as a general piece of advice, that a vegan or plant-based diet is the most health promoting diet? Are you just well, this is what works for me? How do you kind of address that question?
So I think the foundations of a healthy diet at a population level are extremely clear. So if we look at research on basically any population, and you can mix and match the foods that fall within these categories depending on cultural preferences and whatnot. They are diets centered on whole grains, fruits, veggies, nuts and seeds, liquid oils, and then as a protein source, as primary protein sources, either things like legumes or other plant proteins, or fish, typically in certain dairy products. Like that would be sort of the foundation of a healthy diet across the board, with very little in the way of exceptions. Now, if you choose to consume fish over the beans and that, are you really at a disadvantage? The evidence says probably not. There are certain maybe advantages one way or another. They're very minimal, and so that that's one of the ways that I try to push my bias aside. As far as I would love if the world was vegan, but I'm not going to sort of skew the evidence in favor of that. If it seems you can be healthy either way. So then I place a number of different dietary patterns at the top as, quote unquote, the healthiest diet. These can be the Mediterranean. They can be a strictly vegan diet, again, if it's centered on more of those healthy foods, because, Oreos, potato chips are vegan as well. It could be a DASH diet. It could be a portfolio diet. All of these are comparable. I don't think we can say this is the diet that rules them all. At this point, we just have a bunch of diets that fall into that umbrella of quote unquote healthiest diets that hit all of those different foundations that I talked about.
I think that's the problem with social media is people tend to say that one thing is the best, whether it be a diet, supplement, what you could go on and on. And I think that's the problem. There's no nuance available for social media. Speaking of people saying the best diet, we hear the carnivore side of things as well. I want to say debate, but I guess debate it would be the right word. But a lot of people in this side of things will say that carnivore is the healthiest diet. And they always say this is how we were meant to eat. This is how we've ate before. This is how our ancestors used to eat. What would you say to this approach or this?
I'd say who cares? What we used to do. So for example, if we look at average life expectancy during that time, it's maybe in the 30s. Even if we exclude deaths before, say, age, I can't remember if it's 12 or 15, there was an analysis on this, the modal age of death. So the age of death or the age that most people die at in these, various tribes around the world is still over a decade lower than Americans in 2002. It's equivalent to Sweden in the 1700s. Okay. It's really not great. And so I don't care too much to model my diet over populations that ultimately weren't that healthy. Now, at the same time, we have research on people living today. We see that in today's world, even unprocessed meats, even lean meats, compared to plant protein sources, increase the risks of cardiovascular disease, of all-cause mortality, if consumed regularly. I'm not going to say that having 1 or 2 pieces a week is going to be a big deal, but if you're having it daily, it becomes a problem. And so what they are ultimately suggesting when they try to say that, but if you ate all meat, all of a sudden it's healthy, is that there's this risk curve where risk goes up to a serving a day and then all of a sudden plummets. It makes no sense. That's like saying, and they'll often say, but we don't have research on that. And I compare it to this, and this might sound a bit insane, but it's a sort of logical translation here. It'd be like saying, okay, we know that smoking a pack a day of cigarettes a day is bad, right? What if you just lived in a chamber of cigarette smoke. All of a sudden, that's all you inhale, and we expect that to somehow no longer cause risk. Like, it's insane. And so there's really, like, we don't need to look at what our ancestor did. It's not actually informative as to what's healthy now. And we see risk, clear risk, up to at least a serving a day, maybe beyond that. So to suggest that it all of a sudden flips the opposite direction is just ridiculous.
When you say lean meats, do you mean like things like chicken, like lamb, things like that?
So I meant, well, yeah, lamb would be a red meat. So red meats, yes, for sure.
Okay.
For white meats, it depends on what you're replacing. So we don't have as much research on like high levels of consumption of those foods. Interestingly, even in the cohorts where we analyze like white meat intake, for one, high intake often doesn't reach a serving a day, and we don't necessarily know what it's replacing, because what you're doing in most studies, unless they're specifically looking at a substitution of one food for another, is you're looking at replacement of the average background diet. But white meat is healthier than red meat. And so if you're consuming white meat in favor of red meat, or sorry, consuming white meat instead of red meat, then that's going to be a healthier option. But if you're consuming white meat in place of plant protein sources based on the substitution analyses, that is likely a worse option. And so it completely depends on what you're replacing and the amount. The dose is always important there.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I know a lot of people are probably thinking about that. The ancestor thing always kind of makes me laugh a little bit. Like, I'm not an anthropologist or anything like this, but like, you would think in the caveman days, like, we're not eating meat 3 times a day. Like, meat wasn't that accessible. Like, we had to go hunt for it. We had to do all of these things. So it's just like interesting to me when people on the carnivore side say like we used to eat meat and that was it. Like, we probably were eating more like nuts and seeds and berries more than me, I would think, but I don't know.
It depends on where you are, right? So
Right.
the other thing is it's completely location dependent, and there is research now suggesting that people were consuming certain types of legumes, certain types of grains, and so on back then as well. The issue is bones are preserved very well over time. Plant matter isn't. And so it's harder to detect these things
Right.
From the past, where, now with more sophisticated techniques, we're starting to see some of that arise. But again, I would just go back to who cares? Like,
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, it's true. Why does it matter? And if you want to be exactly like your ancestors, you should probably also get off the couch and be a little less sedentary, right?
And get off social media. So
Exactly.
I want to talk about cholesterol, and I do want to do a bit of a deep dive because I have so many questions about this. In my clinic year, I feel like this topic came up all the time, and really, like, depending on what doctor you were talking to, you kind of got a different answer. And that's frustrating for both me and for patients, I assume. So I did want to ask, when it comes to cholesterol, right now, there's this kind of argument that it doesn't matter as much as we used to think it mattered. And so what they'll say in the carnivore community is just like, ignore if your cholesterol goes up, like, that's fine. Or they'll say that animal fats and like dietary cholesterol doesn't raise your actual like lipids. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that area, just because there's just no like clear or concrete answer that I've gotten so far.
Okay, so I would say in the broader scientific evidence, it's extremely clear. I would say there are very few things that are as clear as this topic in the broader scientific research. Like, it's absolutely insane to me that people still push back against it. Now, starting with, do saturated fats and dietary cholesterol raise serum cholesterol or LDL cholesterol levels? Yes, they do. Saturated fat is very clearly impactful, and it's linear. And this was demonstrated by a meta-regression by Minsink and colleagues, if people really want to nerd out and check that out. Now, with dietary cholesterol, it's a little bit more complicated. So it depends partially on genetics. So some people are what we call hyperabsorbers. So they absorb more dietary cholesterol, and others are more resistant to absorption. But on average, we do see an effect. So on average, if you consume more dietary cholesterol, there is an impact if your overall cholesterol intake is low to begin with. So if you are somebody eating a standard Western diet and you're consuming plenty of cholesterol, 400, 500, 600 milligrams of cholesterol a day, adding more doesn't do anything. There's a capacity to our absorption. But if you take somebody who's eating, we'll say, a relatively healthy, plant-rich diet, maybe they're having some animal products, but not a ton of overall cholesterol, then yeah, adding more cholesterol absolutely has an impact. It just plateaus at about 400 milligrams a day. And that's based on the meta-regression by Melissa Vincent is the name. And then this was also shown many years ago, a few decades ago, by Hopkins, I can't remember the first name, in a meta-analysis as well. So that's extremely clear. And we have a recent meta-analysis of egg trials. So one of the best ways to study the impact of eggs, which are loaded with cholesterol but have some saturated fat, not a ton, is to actually compare eggs to egg whites. And so in this recent meta-analysis, if you look at the subgroup of just eggs versus egg whites, and the author was Sikarudi, I'm totally botching that name, there was an impact on LDL cholesterol and a more important marker, ApoB, apolipoprotein B 100. So yes, there is clearly an impact. And for people who aren't aware, ApoB is actually the probably best predictor of risk out of the lipoprotein so far. I don't know how much you guys have learned about it in school. I know there wasn't much about it when I was in school. So I feel like a lot of people don't know. But basically, the reason that LDL particles are harmful is that they contain this protein called ApoB. And that ApoB sort of functions like a magnet with proteoglycans inside the artery wall. So when the LDL moves into that space, in that within the lining of the artery wall, they sort of get held there. And once they're held there, that's when the oxidation of that LDL and consumption by macrophages, et cetera, can happen that leads to plaque development. And so now you can have cases where somebody's LDL is not concordant with the ApoB levels in the blood, because you can have more or less of other compounds that contain ApoB. So if you directly measure ApoB, you get the best, most accurate measure of how much is actually in the blood. So that's like the complicated answer. But basically, we see an impact on both of those markers with egg consumption. Okay. So that's the sort of impact that it has. Now, why do we know that LDL cholesterol or ApoB, beyond a shadow of a doubt, increases risk of cardiovascular disease? Well, there's a few things. For one, we can lower LDL cholesterol. And when I say LDL, it's as a proxy for ApoB. I'm going to stop repeating both. But when you lower LDL, whether that's with statins, with PCSK9 inhibitors, with diet, with other medications like ezetimibe, when you lower LDL, you lower your risk of cardiovascular disease to the degree that you lowered LDL. So it's not even just that they all lower your cardiovascular risk. The risk reduction is proportional to how much LDL was lowered. Now, all of these medications work through different means. So think about what it would mean for that not to be due to LDL reduction. You would have to suggest that each of these different avenues by which we lower LDL are all lowering your heart disease risk through some other mechanism not related to LDL, even though the risk is proportional to how much you lower LDL. Like, that's insane to just still think otherwise. Now, beyond that, we have genetic studies called Mendelian randomization studies. So people with genetically higher or lower risks of, or higher or lower LDL cholesterol levels have higher or lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And the risk reductions are massive, because it's not just that they have lower LDL, but it's through their entire life. So that's the other really key component. It's not about where your LDL is right now. It's how long has it been there. Yeah. And so if you're looking at lower LDL through the entire lifespan, you get massive reductions in cardiovascular risk. At the same time, if you have somebody with familial hypercholesterolemia, where their LDL cholesterol is through the roof, they can have a heart attack in childhood or in their teens or 20s. So that's, again, very problematic. And then the final piece of the puzzle that I'll add here is that if you do what's called LDL apheresis, so this is sometimes done for people with familial hypercholesterolemia, where it's sort of like a dialysis machine that you would use for, say, kidney health, that essentially sucks the LDL out of the blood. So it filters your blood through the system and removes LDL. By literally physically removing LDL from the blood, you lower your heart disease risk and progression of plaque. Okay?
Oh my gosh.
So with all of that together, it is beyond just a conspiracy to suggest that LDL is not a causal risk factor for atherosclerosis. Like, the evidence is so strong and so clear that we don't need anything else. And then, of course, you'll have these keto or carnivore dieters say, oh, but it hasn't been studied in the context of a ketogenic diet or whatever. who cares? So why should we assume that that's different there?
Yeah.
We shouldn't assume the exception. Sure, study it in that context, fine. But you shouldn't assume that the exception's fine. That would be like somebody saying, oh, smoking organic cigarettes is fine because it hasn't been shown to cause cancer. Even though the components that have been linked to cancer are still in there. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, and knowing what we know then about LDL, it would almost be like harmful to do a study on like a ketogenic study.
You could only do it in people who were willingly already adopting that diet. Like it would be unethical to do a randomized trial on this.
Right.
And there are actually some researchers in quotations, trying to do that right now. But they put out their first analysis of the study, and unbeknownst to them, they actually showed rapid progression of plaque in these ideal keto dieters with sky-high LDL. They tried to spin it, but they got absolutely roasted on that attempt on social. And then they had like their lead author said it was the journal's mistake, which is insane. And then they were sort of throwing each other under the bus. And then my colleagues and I, we published a letter in one of the preprint journals. And we're working on additional papers right now, but it's like they basically destroyed their own position, but they're still trying to save face by just like throwing each other under the bus and trying to republish research. And now saying that they're saying their own methods were flawed, which is also hilarious. As they're trying to basically cite more favorable methodology. Like it's so crazy.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's so crazy.
I'm really glad you touched on the eggs. I was going to ask you about that because, so even for me, I eat an omnivore diet. I eat probably less meat than I used to now. But I recently found out I have high lipoprotein a. I haven't tested my ApoB, but my mom has sky high ApoB, so I'm going to go ahead to assume mine is too because she's very, very healthy otherwise. And so that was a bit of a shocker. But now I'm kind of on this train of like, do I need to be concerned about like eggs, about like a protein powder that's high in cholesterol, like things like that? And so I'm glad we touched on it. I do want to ask I know a lot of people who love eggs. They're having eggs every day. So if they're listening to this, and they're wondering like, oh crap, I'm having 4 or 5 eggs every morning. Can they reduce maybe to 3 eggs, add some veggies in there, make sure their fiber intake is up? Because I do feel like people who are prioritizing like the eggs and meat are often less focused on the fiber. Is that going to help reduce that risk? Or is it just kind of like, no, eggs are just not it?
It depends on a few things. For one, the biggest factor, this is going to be a constant theme here, is what you're replacing. Deirdre Tobias, she's an epidemiologist from Harvard, did an awesome editorial on this topic with a study that came out a few years ago. And she actually showed that if you replace other cholesterol-containing foods, so if you replace things like meat and whatnot with eggs actually lower your risk of heart disease. But if you go the other way, if you replace cholesterol-free foods, so if you replace plant foods with eggs, they can raise risk. Now that's also dose dependent. So it depends on like, are you having, at least say an egg a day, sometimes even less than that, but a decent contrast between high and low intakes. Would a few eggs a week be problematic? Yeah, I'd probably not. But if you're talking like a few a day, I'd say that's quite a lot. So it sort of depends on what you meant by that. But like also there's this idea that, and I get this a lot with, people mentioning exercise and other variables. So like, if you were to eat more fiber, if you were to exercise more or whatever, does that cancel out the risk? It doesn't cancel out the risk. It's still like somebody who eats, let's go with one that everyone can sort of agree with. Let's say somebody drinks, 3 Coca-Colas every day, but they exercise, they don't smoke, they eat plenty of fruits and veggies, they eat, 35, 40 grams of fiber a day. Does that mean that the Coca-Cola doesn't increase risk? No, it does. That person's still healthier than somebody who eats a super high calorie, hyper palatable, ultra processed food diet who doesn't drink soda. Like they'd still be healthier because on the net, they're doing more good things. But if they were to eat that healthy diet and not consume the Coke every day, they would still be better off. So it's not like you don't just cancel risk. It's all cumulative here. So I'd have to look at it through that sort of lens.
Definitely. It's fascinating because I feel like eggs, like you can take 10 people who like are like quote unquote experts on nutrition, and it's like you're like cut down the middle with that response about eggs. So I'm really glad we touched on it. And it seems like there's maybe newer
I think
evidence.
there's a lot of there's a lot of, I don't know what the word is, like sort of love or bias towards eggs. It seems like they sort of have a health halo. But what's interesting is one of the pieces of pushback I've gotten before, to someone who agreed that at a level, let's say it is daily intake, that risk increases, is that, well, eggs provide important nutrition, but the problem is if you were to consume the levels not associated with risk, they aren't really contributing much nutrition. So it's like I'd still prefer to get that nutrition from other sources, but I would fully acknowledge that in replacement of things like meats and whatnot, eggs are certainly a much better choice.
Okay, that's good to know. Kind of the last question on this topic, because you hear this actually in our space quite a bit too, that it's not the animal fats, it's more the carbs that are increasing cholesterol. So I feel like we know the answer, but I want you to touch on it because I hear this still all the time.
Yeah, I would just ask based on what trials have shown that. Like you can have a slight increase with added sugars, possibly. I think particularly in the form of sweetened beverages. The exact mechanisms I'm not clear on, but it's a relatively small increase. It's nowhere near what you get with saturated fats. With like starches and things, I haven't seen anything. Maybe through a mechanism of weight gain, like if you're eating a lot of refined carbohydrates and gaining weight, but even weight gain has a very small impact on lipids. Like replacing butter with oils is probably one of the biggest things you can do for lowering your lipids, and that's because you're replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fats. So yeah, I would just say, like, that's not even my place to debunk that. It'd be on them to provide evidence for it, because as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing to support that. And what's particularly comical here is that if somebody were to even try to cite evidence for that, I guarantee it's nowhere near the level of evidence we have for saturated fat. And this is something that I see often. There's all these double standards. People will say, oh, observational research is crap, but then they'll cite observational research when they're biased or what have you. I see it in the carnivore space all the time. So no, I'd love for somebody to present evidence that they think is compelling and then explain to me why the evidence I would cite is not compelling, because there's no way they can skirt that line without being contradictory.
Exactly. I'd love to get your take on this. Why do you think it's so hard for people to change their opinions when it comes to like health science or nutrition science? Even if you share like solid evidence, basically debunk what they're standing for. I think seed oils are like the perfect example of this. Why do you think it's still so hard for people to acknowledge the evidence?
Well, because people eat every day, 3 times a day in most cases, and so it's something that you've done forever, and you probably have your routines, your preferences. There's certain like cultural or social norms that are tied to how you eat. There's a lot of potential for biases there. At the same time, particularly when it comes to a lot of the larger, we'll say, nutrition creators on social media, there's often this hesitancy to acknowledge when one is wrong, because then your followers will, think, oh, hey, what else are they wrong about? Whereas like I actually view it as like, I really respect that when someone will change their views based on new information. But that's not necessarily the case for everybody. And so I think there's a number of possible reasons. I don't think there's one. Actually, nowadays, I'd say your dietary intake is tied to your political views as well, for whatever stupid reason. So, there's all sorts of reasons that somebody might be hesitant to acknowledge that or change their ways.
Yeah, when me and Vic interviewed Dr. Jordan Robertson last year, we talked about this a lot, like how people online will create businesses like seed oil promoter. I don't even know. Someone probably has an Instagram handle out there or whatever it is. Yeah, you should change yours. So yeah, it's when you build businesses and your income and your livelihood is dependent on opinions, basically. Even if you think that what someone else is saying might be true, you can't really change your opinion online, at least. So yeah, it can definitely get dicey.
I think there's just hesitancy too.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I do want to talk about seed oils because I feel like we can't have an episode with you without talking about it. Something that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough, or maybe it does, but it kind of gets foreshadowed by other things, is like the appeal to nature fallacy with seed oils. Like people will point that the way that they're processed specifically is what makes them toxic. Like hexane is used and all these other things, and beef tallow is natural and it's not processed, and all these things. And I think especially like in naturopathic medicine, people can fall into like the natural is better. So yeah, I would just like for you to talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, people always call like canola oil engine lubricant because an earlier iteration of rapeseed oil that wasn't even the type that we consume was used in certain ways like that. But then like beef tallow was used to lubricate machinery too. Like it's
Right.
who cares? None of that matters. So it comes down to health outcomes. I think before we get to health outcomes, I think there's also a huge misunderstanding about the processing and what that means. So for example, they will often, not always, but often use hexane as a solvent to extract fats from the plant. And the reason it's used is because it boils at a low temperature. So you can basically have the fats dissolve in the hexane, lightly heat that. The hexane evaporates off, and then you're left with the oil. So that's the reason. It's not like you're consuming a bunch of hexane in there. In fact, they've done a bunch of tests, and often cases there's zero detectable or at most trace amounts that would not be meaningful. At the same time, people will mention other volatile organic compounds like benzene, which aren't even used, so that makes no sense. But you're likely to ingest far more benzene by filling up your car at a gas station just by inhaling. Like that's how little we're talking about, but nobody thinks about that. You go walk around the block, you're not going to skip across the street to avoid walking next to the gas station. And so the levels of exposure are minuscule. Now there's also concerns over like bleaching that comes up, and I feel like when people hear bleaching, because that's used to remove some of the potential impurities in there, so it's actually to make it a cleaner product. People think of bleach like chemical bleach that we use, and that's not at all what's used. They use bleaching earths. These are actually, in a sense, like natural compounds found in the earth and the minerals and whatnot that you can use to soak up some of the impurities. And so if there are whatever other compounds in there and remove some of the odors and things like that. So like these are all pretty benign in once you actually understand what's happening. Now, what ultimately matters are health outcomes. So what actually happens if you replace saturated fat in particular with these polyunsaturated fat-rich oils? And we have a few different ways to look at this. So for one, we have observational studies, those who consume more of these oils. There's a recent study published in JAMA that looked at butter and plant-based oils, and they found that the plant oils lowered risks of total mortality. And this was true for, I believe it was corn oil, soybean oil, and olive oil individually, and then also when different oils were lumped together. And that was with a pretty small dose. I think it was like a tablespoon or maybe even less per day. Now, there's also biomarker studies. So rather than actually basing the our position on like what people are reporting as far as intake, we can actually measure levels of linoleic acid in their body. So linoleic acid is the predominant fatty acid in a lot of the quote unquote seed oils like soybean, safflower, sunflower, and so on. And we don't produce linoleic acid. So if it's in your body, it's because you consumed it. So that's really important here. And those with higher levels in their tissues have lower risks of all-cause mortality. So that's a really good way to measure intake and to show that actually higher consumption is likely a really good thing. And then we have randomized controlled trials. So we have the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study, which I would argue is probably one of the best randomized controlled trials ever conducted in nutrition, full stop. This was 8 years done in essentially like hospital type settings or long-term care settings. And basically people were randomized to one cafeteria or another. One cafeteria, they extracted the saturated fat from these foods and basically injected seed oils. And then in the other cafeteria, they consumed the saturated fat laden versions of like the same foods.
Wow.
And so really well conducted, and people didn't know what they were consuming. So it's also double blinded, which is very unique for nutrition studies. And there were roughly, again, pardon me on the exact numbers, somewhere between 30 to 35% reductions in a number of different cardiovascular events. I believe it was total new coronary events and stroke combined, and a few other findings. But again, I can't remember the exact specific ones. But like a lot of the major cardiovascular events.
Wow.
Now, there's another study done in Oslo, not quite as rigorously designed, but same sort of deal where it's saturated fat versus unsaturated fats. We also saw reductions there. When you meta-analyze these studies, at least the ones that were deemed acceptable based on methodological limitations, there's reductions in cardiovascular events. But what a lot of people in the in the sort of carnivore space will cite are the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, the Sydney Diet Heart Study, and the Rose Corn Oil Trial. So these are the three that they love to cite to suggest that seed oils are harmful. One, the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. This was done in the 60s and early 70s. And they had about 9,000 people at baseline. So this was done in mental hospitals in Minnesota or around Minnesota. And they randomized them to saturated fat or unsaturated fats, which were, I believe, corn oil and corn oil margarines. And they did not detect any significant difference in risk. So that's what's sort of ironic about it, is they'll cite it to suggest harm, but there was not harm in the intervention group. Now, they will then look at those who reduced their cholesterol levels the most, did see a higher risk of mortality, and they will use that to suggest that, well, people who are most compliant then had risk. But there's a couple problems. For one, they started with over 9,000 people, but by the time they did the analysis of people who actually stuck with it over a year, 75% had dropped. And that's because there was a trend towards outpatient treatment, so they were no longer staying in treatment, so no longer adherent. And the corn oil margarine that they used at the time likely contained trans fats. So those who saw a larger reduction in cholesterol levels were probably consuming more of the margarine that's rich in trans fats, and that's not good. So even with that, there was no significant difference between intervention and control, which is crazy. Now, the second one people cite is the Sydney Diet Heart Study. I don't have much to say about the study design. It was overall very well designed, but the margarine they used was very rich in trans fats. And so, yeah, the seed oil was bad in that case, but it was loaded with trans fats. And at the time, they didn't know about the risk of trans fats. This was, again, back in the 60s.
Right.
And so they inadvertently provided really good evidence that trans fats are really bad for us at a time when we didn't know that. And then the third study, the Rose Corn Oil Study, there, again, were no significant differences between corn oil, olive oil, and the saturated fat control. It was a very small study relative to all the other ones. And most of the cardiovascular events that did occurred very early, within the first 6 to 12 months, suggesting that it might not have even been due to the diet. Like, these might have been pre-existing things that were going to occur anyway. But either way, it wasn't significantly different between groups. So it's not super compelling. And so, like, these are the three studies that they hold on a pedestal to support their claims, and they are extremely flawed. And I actually did a 2.5-hour debate, or maybe even longer, maybe it's 3.5-hour debate on this topic with Dr. Goodrich on Simon Hill's podcast as well, where we dove into great detail in all of these. And he ultimately had no good criticisms for that LA veteran study because it is so well.
Wow. Okay. I love that. I love that you have the receipts, that you came with the receipts. I always appreciate that. But I think everybody will. I did want to ask, if we were to leave out saturated fats from the conversation, is there, because I fall into this too. I have this bias here where I'll have canola oil. Like, I'm not worried if there's canola oil in my product, but I always lean towards olive oil or avocado oil. Should I be doing that, or does it really matter at the end of the day?
It doesn't matter. And in fact, I'd say the two oils with the strongest evidence base right now are olive oil and canola oil. I'd say they're top of the list. There are some studies directly comparing olive oil to just vegetable oils as a whole, and there doesn't seem to be an advantage one way or another. There are, looking at, again, like outcomes, like hard outcomes. There is a study comparing or looking at olive oil, butter, margarines, corn oil, and canola oil. And both olive and canola did very well. Corn oil did quite well as well, but maybe slightly less so than the canola and olive oil. There's a study comparing avocados to even vegetable oils or olive oils separately, though. So it was like seed oils versus the olive. And in each case, there was no significant difference in total cardiovascular events. There was actually, for heart disease events specifically, possibly a slight advantage to the seed oils over avocado. But then in the case of stroke, it went the other way a bit. So it was like ended up being kind of a wash. There was no difference in the total cardiovascular events. And so I don't think that there's, even when you consider whole plant foods with some fiber, I don't think there's a clear advantage. And this is possibly because the concentration of polyunsaturated fats in the seed oils is so high that they actually lower lipids more than most other things. So like comparing olive oil and canola actually lowers LDL cholesterol more than olive oil.
Wow.
Other seed oils likely do as well, but there aren't as many direct comparisons there. And canola isn't even the highest in polyunsaturated fats. It's actually relatively close to olive oil in fat content.
Wow.
So there's no good reason to choose one over the other. I would say the seed oils are generally cheaper too, which is nice.
Yep.
Whereas like the olive oil, the reason that even though seed oils might lower LDL more, but the reason that the outcomes might be about the same for overall risk is I'm guessing the seed oils lower the LDL more, but the olive oil often comes with more phytochemicals that might sort of neutralize that benefit, right? Like you kind of get benefits either way. But that's just a speculation on my part as far as like what might explain that.
Interesting. So really seed oils are kind of like a health food. Maybe not when
I would absolutely.
They are, yeah.
I would, absolutely call them a health food.
I think it's just the argument of like when you add oil to like fried food for anything, it doesn't matter if it's beef tallow or seed oils, like you're eating fried food. Like, it's not going to be great for you. But
sorry, I was just going to say that's one of the things that they bring up is that, well, look at this increase in like soybean oil intake over the past 4 decades and look at our heart disease event rates. Well, for one, heart disease actually declined in recent years. So that's one thing. But but even so, it's like, that's just a very gross sort of correlation between the two. And where were most of those seed oils coming from? From hyperpalatable, ultra processed foods that we are over consuming. And so it's like saying water is the devil because it's in Coca-Cola. Like, obviously that's not the case. You need to look at the whole package and what makes it a problem. And it's generally the high calorie density with the salt or sugar or white flour that's all packed together.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously everybody really cares about protein. And this is like argument, I think that's been coming up for ages when it comes to talking about plant-based eating versus like an omnivore diet or a carnivore diet. How do you talk about this? How do you have discussions about this, especially with the whole argument of like that complete versus incomplete protein? Can you get enough protein without supplementation as someone who's plant-based? What does that look like?
So for one, I think as far as protein goals, I actually think the RDA is suboptimal. So RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram. I generally suggest like 1.2 grams per kilogram is a good target, or if you're looking to maximize muscle and strength, maybe going up to 1.6. While resistance training, obviously that's the most important factor. You can't just sit on your butt and do that. But when it comes to the animal versus plant thing, there's a few arguments. So for one is, can you get the same amount of protein? Yes, you can. If you replace 80% lean beef with tofu, same amount of protein per calorie. If you replace it with seitan or textured vegetable protein, which is like very concentrated protein and acts as a good like meaty substitute, then you can actually increase your protein intake with the plant option. It's comparable to the extra lean meats, like the 95, 97% lean meats. If you replace eggs with the tofu scramble, tofu actually has more protein. If you replace dairy milk with like soy or pea-based milk, you get about the same or more protein, depending on the fat content of the milk, per calorie, of course. So there's a lot of ways to match the same level of protein. And I'd even say like whole lentils, they fall a little bit short of that 80% lean beef, but not by much. So there's a lot of ways to get that same amount of protein. But then the other argument gets brought up of, well, what about, amino acid profiles, complete proteins, and so on. There's this idea that plants don't contain all of the 9 essential amino acids, and that's just false. Every single plant food that hasn't been like extracted, so like pure sugar obviously doesn't, but otherwise all plant foods contain all of the 9 essential amino acids, but in varying proportions. So, certain foods like beans might have less methionine, and other foods like grains might have less lysine. But the goal there is just to consume more than one food in a day, and you're good. It's really not that hard. And it doesn't mean that you have to combine at each meal. Our bodies are actually very smart that way. They maintain pools of amino acids. So, your breakfast will combine with your lunch, will combine with your dinner, will combine with the proteins being, broken down and recycled in your body anyway. So like there's all sorts of ways that is compensated for. So it's really a non-issue. And then, they transition to the next argument of, but what about bioavailability? Now, when people bring this up, I ask them based on what metrics and how are they measured? And nobody knows this. They can never answer this. Even protein experts. Like I've seen Lane Norton, who I have a little bit of beef with online, who literally can't answer this question. He acknowledged as much in the podcast. So when you have the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, or the PDCAS, and the digestible indispensable amino acid score, or DIAS, what they do in the case of the PDCAS is they feed foods to rodents. They measure how much protein goes in one end and how much comes out the other end. And the difference is presumably what was absorbed. There's a few issues, though. For one, we aren't rodents. We have different digestive tracts, different protein needs, different growth rates. And so it's not directly translatable. Second, because it's looking at absorption or presumable absorption through the entire digestive tract, it's exposed to some of the microbes in the colon that could otherwise break down some of the proteins as well. So it might skew the numbers a little bit. But then they try to address some of those with the DIAS score. So this is measured in pigs typically. And they will extract the protein at the end of the small intestine, inserting a tube through the abdomen. It's pretty grotesque, but it's what they do. They'll measure the digestion from mouth to end of the small intestine, avoiding all of that digestion that might happen by microbes. There's still some problems, though. Again, we aren't pigs for all the same issues that I mentioned with the rodents, but they also often use raw foods. So they'll use raw grains, raw beans, and so on that are less digestible than the cooked versions, which is what we actually consume. And so that might skew the numbers for certain plant proteins a bit as well. But the biggest problem, and this is the part that just nobody seems to understand, is that they don't actually measure protein absorption. They sort of do. It's a part of the equation, but it's not what the numbers are telling us. What they do is they measure the absorption of the essentially least available amino acid. So as I mentioned earlier, beans contain less methionine. So they will look at how much methionine are you absorbing, and is that enough to meet your needs, or is it comparable to whatever their standard protein is? Here's the problem. Let's say you had, just for sake of argument, 100% protein absorption, which doesn't really happen with any food. But let's say you had 100% absorption. You might still only get a score of 50 because it only provides 50% of your methionine. So it's like if you had a report card and you had straight A pluses on 8 subjects, but a C minus on 1 subject, your report card would just read C minus. It would not tell you anything else. And so the protein absorption is actually quite high when we actually measure total protein or total absorption. We see that high quality plant proteins are comparable within a few percent of animal-based proteins. We find that somewhat processed plant foods like tofu, seitan, plant-based meats, soy milk are very high, like well into the 90s, high 90s even, which is right around what you see with meat. And then for the whole plant foods like legumes, I believe lentils or split peas or peas are around 91%. Other legumes are in the 80s. Like it's not that huge of a difference.
Yeah.
So it's really the differences are just completely oversold, just people are talking about them way more than they I think should be. Now, what ultimately matters is, do you get the same results? And so we have randomized controlled trials, or actually not all randomized, but clinical trials will say comparing either vegan or near plant exclusive diets to more omnivorous diets rich in animal foods. And they find with resistance training, as long as you're eating the same amount of protein, so at least 1.6 grams per kilogram per day or more, there are no significant differences in basically any measure of muscular strength. And so you can clearly get the same result. And that means that even if there are these small differences in absorption or amino acid profiles or whatever, they don't matter. It does not convert into an actual meaningful result. So now, with that, there's no reason to choose the animal protein over plant protein for additional gains. And when we look at the health outcome data, replacing animal proteins with plant proteins is clearly the better choice for long-term health. So I'm a huge advocate. I think that's one of the biggest shifts that people can make, is even like a few times a week, shifting some of your animal protein towards plant protein sources could make a meaningful difference in your long-term health.
Absolutely. I know that we do, when we think of protein, we're focused a lot on like muscle protein synthesis, growing our muscles, those like gains. But what about from a weight loss standpoint? Because calorically, we hear a lot of like a Greek yogurt is really low in calories, high in protein, and then like lean chicken, like things like that that have that low calorie profile, high protein are a really easy way to kind of keep in the caloric deficit. How do we approach that for someone who wants to be more plant-based but wants to lose weight, let's say?
Yeah, so I would look at things like the TVP or seitan I mentioned earlier. Those
Yeah.
are almost pure protein. Like they're going to be very low
Okay.
calorie or a high protein per calorie. Um, there's protein shakes are an amazing option. I think super
Yeah.
convenient, super easy. I often will use them at work if I'm got a busy day, don't really have a lunch break, just
Yep.
to slam in 10 minutes if I have to. So there's a number of different ways to go about it there, and then of
Yeah.
course you know compiling or compounding a bunch of like fruits and veggies alongside whatever protein sources you're using helps reduce the caloric density as well. So
Right.
there's a number of ways to go about it.
Okay.
Mhm. I want to get your take on fake meats or plant-based meat alternatives because I think there is kind of a divide when people think about these as well. People often bash them, saying that they're like highly processed, high in sodium, all of these. When you look at if you're replacing red meat or even lean sources of meats with like plant-based meats, are you still seeing those beneficial changes? Is there any research that has looked at that?
Yeah, I actually published a review in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology last year on this very topic.
Oh.
So the with some researchers at UBC. So the plant-based meats, they're, I think, sorely misunderstood. At their basis, basically, there's some type of protein isolate, some type of oil, many of which we've already talked about, and then whatever sort of flavoring, spices, herbs, whatever they're adding for that. Those are sort of the main foundations to a lot of the plant-based meats. Now, there has been a huge sort of campaign to bash plant-based meats, particularly over their processing. So the Center for Consumer Freedom, this is an organization that has some backing from animal ag and fast food chains as well, actually organized a campaign, sort of a blitz, so to speak, to bash plant-based meats and to basically use the public's pre-existing concerns over processed foods against them, against the plant-based meats. And they actually took out a Super Bowl ad, I think this was a couple years ago now, where they had children in a spelling bee trying to pronounce ingredients or something like that. It was like methyl cellulose. It's like, that's a fiber. It's not even that big a deal. But, they have these kids trying to pronounce these words and making it seem bad. And just think about
Oh
that.
gosh.
This organization took out a
Wow.
Super Bowl ad, which I believe are like $8 million for 30 seconds or something. Like, this crazy. Just to bash, not even to
Wow.
promote a product, okay?
Yeah.
To bash a product, which is insane. But that
Wow.
aside, so like that's also funny when people talk about the whole like conspiracies around people pushing plant-based meats. It's like, no, if anything, it's going the other way here.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Okay. Anyways, back to the research. So we found after reviewing the available studies on like nutritional composition of plant-based meats, that plant-based meats tended to have less saturated fat, obviously less cholesterol, more fiber, and in some cases lower in calorie content per serving compared to animal-based products. Now, that is one part of the picture, but we actually looked at studies, randomized controlled trials comparing plant-based meats to their animal-based counterparts, and this was super interesting. So plant-based meats basically across the board lowered LDL and total cholesterol levels compared to animal-based meats. In the studies, although most didn't measure ApoB, in the studies that did, there was either no significant change or a reduction with the plant-based meats. There were also no changes or no differences in blood pressure despite the high salt content of many plant-based meats.
Wow.
And so there were potential for benefits. Oh, and there was some studies suggesting a bit of weight loss with the plant-based meats. So we're seeing benefits, but basically no detriment for cardiovascular risk factors to swapping out animal-based meats for plant-based meats. Now, of course, there's variability. Some plant-based meats are going to be loaded with saturated fat from coconut oil, and you could
Right.
probably compare that to a super lean meat and see some advantage for the lean meat. I wouldn't discount that. But on average, this is what we see. Now, there were also but then at the same time, if you took the lean meat and a high polyunsaturated fat plant-based meat, I would expect the plant-based meat to do better, just to balance that out. But ultimately, we don't have the long-term data on cardiovascular outcomes at this point, but we know very well that LDL is a causal risk factor, as I already discussed, and seeing improvements there is super meaningful. And I would note that if we look at the swap meat study, which was one of the ones that we included, they compared Beyond Meat products, the old version of Beyond Meat products that were higher in saturated fat, which they've now reformulated to make lower. But the old version versus grass-fed and organic meats, and the Beyond Meat still did better. So that's a really big takeaway.
Wow. People are not going to like that.
Exactly. So like, and the new ones would almost certainly do better just based on the changes in content. And actually, on that note, I want to mention this is one of the great things about processed foods. Is that we can reformulate them. You can change them. You can make them healthier. You can't just do that with a cow overnight, right? That takes generations of selective breeding and all sorts of crazy stuff. Until we have cell-based or cultured meat. But like that's one of the things that we can do. And yeah, they lowered the sodium content, they lowered the saturated fat content, they upped the protein content. These are all really great things, making them ultimately a healthier product. And I think that's one of the things that we have to sort of get out of our head is that processed foods are necessarily bad. There's a huge range of processed foods from sodas to sausages to whole grain breads and cereals to donuts in between. So they're all over the place. And when we actually separately evaluate the different types of ultra processed foods, we see that there's a huge spectrum. Some improve health outcomes like those whole grain products, and some worsen health outcomes like the processed meats and Coca-Cola.
I would say that I'm pretty much plant-based except for some like Greek yogurt here and there, but I'm gonna get hate for this, but I use plant-based meats quite a bit, especially if I'm making like tacos or something. I'll use like the ground beef that they have and like things like that every so often, and I really enjoy it. But yeah, I always thought that was really interesting. I've heard you talk about it a couple of times, and I needed you to talk about it on the podcast because I think a lot of people don't know this information. It's really interesting to hear. I want to talk about soy. I know this could obviously be like a whole podcast on its own. So just briefly, I think, well, it is. Soy is a huge major source of plant-based protein. It's found in a lot of plant-based foods. And there's still a lot of misinformation surrounding the safety of soy when it comes to breast cancer risk and all of those things, how it plays a role in estrogen and testosterone and all of those things as well. Just briefly, as of 2025, what does the research have to say about soy consumption and hormones?
I mean, it says the same thing it has for a long time. Basically, the phytoestrogens in soy are not the same as our own estrogens. There are actually phytoestrogens in many foods, but for some reason, soy gets picked out. So they contain certain, so these phytoestrogens have certain chemical components that mimic estrogen or in say shape or size, so they can interact with estrogen receptors in our body. But the thing is, they preferentially bind to certain estrogen receptors that have specific effects in different parts of the body. So in breast tissue, the estrogen receptors they preferentially bind to are actually anti-estrogenic. In bone tissue, they're pro-estrogenic. Those are both good things. We want estrogenic effects in bone tissue to lay down more bone tissue, and then we want anti-estrogenic effects in breast tissue to prevent breast cancer risk. And so this is actually what we see in the long-term follow-up studies, particularly when soy intake reaches, say daily or close to daily consumption, not necessarily like we see in the West. We see reductions in breast cancer risk. We also see reductions in a number of other cancers like prostate cancer in men, potentially endometrial cancer, potentially stomach cancer, and other gastrointestinal cancers, as well as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and so on, although the level of evidence varies depending on the specific outcome. Now, we also have a recent meta-analysis looking at measures of estrogenicity. So this wasn't just estrogen or testosterone levels, but also like endometrial thickness and that. And there were no clinically significant effects on any of those outcomes in that meta-analysis of clinical trials. And we have another previous clinical trial on men, randomized meta-analysis of clinical trials on men from, I believe it was 2021 by Reed et al. And that one found no significant effects on testosterone or estrogen levels there either. The evidence is so abundantly clear at this point. In addition to soy being an excellent source of protein and matching whey protein for muscle gains as well, like there's really no reason to fear soy, and it's an extremely nutritious food that we can include in the diet. Of course, if somebody has allergies or sensitivities, you can skirt around that. Even if you want it to be plant-based, it just obviously, particularly with eating out, becomes a little more challenging because it is often a common protein source, but it doesn't mean it's impossible, certainly when it comes to like home cooking and that.
I still see those videos floating around the internet about, especially for men, how soy causes man boobs. And it's like, I don't know, like we have pretty clear evidence that high animal-based diet can increase your risk for things like prostate cancer, right?
Yeah.
That's still
Well,
something.
certain things, especially that's actually one that dairy is linked to.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So we have this, and then we have evidence that soy is actually beneficial, and yet we're still kind of stuck on these things that are still circulating the internet, which is a good kind of transition into my last question for you. What are some red flags for our listeners to look out for when it comes to social media and all of this kind of quote unquote nutrition science that everybody thinks they're an expert on? What should we be looking for?
I think for one, absolute claims like this is absolutely the one thing, or we know for certain, or whatever. There are a few areas where I think that is reasonable, like with the LDL cholesterol talk, given the strength of the evidence. But very few things, or in very few areas, is the evidence that crystal clear. So that's one. The other is just no references. I see this all the time. People always say like a study, and then they don't link anything, which just annoys the crap out of me. So that's a big one. More on the comical side, but a hint of seriousness is if you see a shirtless dude in a grocery store, it's probably best to just skip that one.
Yeah.
So like that's a big one. And then I would say like how this you'd have to dig a little bit deeper for, but like how do they respond to potential criticisms or questions? So, if someone asks a question, are they engaging and I don't expect people to reply to every comment. I certainly don't either. But if they do reply, are they engaging with what's being said? Are they providing a source if that's the question? Are they responding to a source that's provided if that was in the comment? Oftentimes people will just resort to like insults and stuff. Like I see that a lot, especially from people who also push the whole like soy boy stuff. They tend to want to have that image. Actually, Mind Pump, this was hilarious. I don't know if you guys saw my videos with Mind Pump Media. They're podcasters. I did two of them because they responded in a terrible way to the first one, but like they just like kind of lost it and resorted to insults, like literally full on insults, and a bunch of their own followers started commenting saying that they were handling it very poorly.
Oh my
gosh! And then they started. They posted. I kid you not. These are like 40-year-old men who then in their Instagram stories posted about how they're going to eat more meat to piss off the vegans because apparently my post had pissed them off. Like that's how petty they were.
That's crazy.
Wow. Like it was really crazy. But anyways, like that sort of response is pretty telling, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. Where can our listeners follow along with you? Can they book with you? Are you taking patients? What does that look like?
Yeah. So for one, you can follow me on basically all the socials, just at Dr. Matthew Nagra. For most of them, that's dr.matthewnagra. Instagram's where I'm most active, but I post the same videos or clips to YouTube, TikTok, or whatever. And then as far as booking, if they're in BC, so I see patients via telemedicine across BC or in person at Tanumi Integrated Health on Commercial Drive in Vancouver. Otherwise, I'd say follow me online.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
No
Thank
problem.
you.